Hi guys, so as we know there's a shortage of heavy goods vehicle drivers at the moment, along with a shortage of other workers. This is due to two things. One is the ending of freedom of movement as a core aspect of Brexit, and the second is the stricter immigration rules brought in by Priti Patel at the Home Office. Now, some weeks ago I showed you a select committee that had met with industry leaders, those from the farming sector, who had raised the impact of these shortages with those present at the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee. The representatives of the committee promised that they would raise the problems industry is facing with the respective ministers. Well, that brings us to George Eustice, the Environment Secretary, who answered questions at the committee this week. He was challenged on the heavy goods vehicle driver shortage and how it's impacting many sectors, but he was also asked why he ignored the warnings from the sector about what problems would occur. Let's hear the question and the minister's response.
Yeah. Secretary of State, Mr Kennedy, thank you very much for coming. Just want to touch on, if I can, on the government actions to date so far. So in answer to an earlier question, I think, Mr Kennedy, you mentioned that you believe the demand supply will be back in balance beyond the short-term visa scheme. But there's no certainty to that, is there? So given that, what sort of you set out, if you look at the sectors, poultry, HGV drivers and pork butchers, why were they chosen specifically for temporary visas and not a longer term visa? I don't know whether the Secretary of State wants to touch on that first.
Will I come in on that?
You go first and I'll pick up. But yeah.
So we work very closely across the whole range of industry, and particularly through something that I've set up called the Food Resilience Industry Forum, where we have 200 industry executives meeting on a regular basis so that we can get intelligence and data. And then we hone in on wherever there is a problem. So through COVID, that took us to suspending competition legislation.
Notice that, and you will see this throughout this committee, is that they avoid talking about the B word. I don't know whether it was George Eustice that decided we're not going to mention Brexit. We're going to focus on the pandemic. Now, the pandemic is short term. Brexit is long term. And industry understand that Brexit is long term, and they've asked for visas to be extended for longer periods of time. Now, the government had the original idea of having visas end on Christmas Eve. Kick these people out on Christmas Eve. Then it was we're going to extend it till January. Then it was, we're going to have it for 6 months. But industry said this is not enough. If you remember in the previous video, they said we need 1 year visas perhaps. We understand you're not going to bring back freedom of movement. Some of them were quite pragmatic and said, look, we don't expect you to do that, but we need something long term. But you will notice here that George Eustice in particular will not mention Brexit.
Because to social distancing, to test and trace and apps, and then more recently, there are high vacancies across the food industry, but on the other hand, they are manageable in the sense production is holding up. There were some particular areas where the data has said, and we have to wait until the data says there's a problem. So there were people calling for us to change immigration.
What do you mean people calling? Industry were calling. Industry who are working in the industry, they were saying, we need people now. And your response was, well, the data doesn't represent that. What data? Can we see the data? No, we can't. This was about protecting the politician. The politician decided we're not going to help industry out. And I've said this before. It was about offloading responsibility onto industry. Let industry sort it out. Industry said, we can't sort it out because we need workers. These workers have to come into the country. We can't bring them into the country because you have put up these barriers. So we have to rely on you to ease these barriers. And you have decided we're not going to ease these barriers. We're not going to ease these barriers. And this went on for months, including George Eustice there on the left, who said, we're not going to ease these barriers. Industry have to sort the problem out themselves. And now, after months of calling and telling ministers, we can't sort this out, going to select committees and saying, we can't sort this out, it's the responsibility of the government. Now the government are saying, yes, we're going to sort it out. But the data doesn't represent any sort of problem.
For butchers, but the data didn't bear this out. The minute it did, we can make a case and we can address that. So it's very close monitoring of data, understanding what are the real problems and pinch points in the system, and then acting very quickly to address them.
Is he suggesting that industry was lying here? Because I'd love to see this data. Because if the data showed that there wasn't a requirement for extra workers, then why were industry asking for extra workers?
That's what happened with turkeys, it's what happened with butchers, it's what happened with HGV drivers.
But that data, I mean, you say that data, but it's shown on both those, on the butchers and the HGV drivers, that actually the change is too late. You're still, there's a lag, isn't there? So the decision was still behind the curve, as it were. Despite the fact that the industry, and we've had the industry here in the inquiry, quite clearly saying that they set out very early on that these problems were coming down the track. They believe they're within their, if you trust them in their own sectors and what they're seeing and the trends they're seeing, they saw it coming down the track. But government didn't react straight away. What you're saying is it had to wait for the data to be quite clear. But then, when that data is quite clear, the issue is already out there, isn't it? And the potential damage is done.
Yes, because industry were saying, we need the workers now, and the response from government was, we're not going to give you the workers now, we want to look at the data. When we think that the data points to easing the restrictions on immigration, then we'll make that change. Then when finally the government decided, okay, yes, we can't hold off any longer, industry said, but it's too late now. And I've covered this before. For example, the turkey industry, we're saying we're actually not going to produce as many turkeys next year because we don't know if we'll have the staff. And what happens then, and it was raised in the previous committee, is that, well, supermarkets will not rely on British producers, they'll rely on EU producers. So the whole idea behind Brexit was to unshackle ourselves from the European Union, but by imposing Brexit restrictions on industry, you're driving supermarkets to import goods from abroad. And George Eustice will still refuse to say anything bad about Brexit.
Well, I think, again, it comes back to, I mean, I'll address your way, but there comes back to this issue about the difficulty of predicting how things would happen in a pandemic. And
it's not the pandemic, because what he's going to go on to say is, everyone no one could have predicted this. Everyone was suffering these consequences, but we don't see supermarket shelves empty in Europe. There are shortages of heavy goods vehicle drivers. Yes, there are shortages, but it has been resolved to a certain extent because we're able to find drivers from other areas to fill the gap, to make sure that supermarket shelves are not empty, that animals can be brought to slaughter, that the industries can function because they don't have this shortage of labour. The only place that's suffering a massive critical shortage of labour is Britain. Why? Because of Brexit. But George Eustice will refuse to say the B word because he used to be in UKIP and now he's a Conservative, and he will defend Brexit to the end.
So on HGV drivers, the biggest challenge that we got, as Grant Shapps would point out to you if he was here, is that this is a profession where the average age is well into their 50s. What happened during the pandemic is they were locked down, they were spending time with their family, and for them, again, it's in some ways the most human of reasons, having done that for several months, it was a chance for them to take stock about what they were doing with their lives, what they wanted to do. And many of them, for the most natural of reasons, said, you know what, I'm just not going to go back to being a long-distance lorry driver, away from my family several nights a week, dealing with all of that. I'm going to get a different job. And so there was a huge loss of HGV drivers from the system.
To a certain extent. But if that were true, if that was the only reason, then why didn't Europe suffer the same fate? Why didn't Europe suffer the same level of loss of heavy goods vehicle drivers? It didn't. So obviously that is not the only reason. Yes, some drivers during the pandemic decided, look, this job is too much for me. And of course, we've covered before how the resources available, the services I should say, available for heavy goods vehicle drivers on the continent are to a much higher standard than those available in Britain. The conditions are much better in Europe than in Britain. So many drivers in Britain decided, look, I can't do this work. And especially if there are fewer drivers available, it has put more pressure on those who are available to drive. And many have said, look, I can't continue this way and I'm leaving the industry. But it's not just because of the pandemic. It's because of Brexit as well. But of course, George Eustice cannot admit that.
Coming out of lockdown. And that did lead to quite, as furlough ended, it was difficult to predict what would happen. Would those people come back? But a lot of them at the end of furlough just chose not to come back. And so there are a lot of people that just became economically inactive or changed jobs. And this was particularly pronounced when it came to lorry drivers. Now, the one thing I would say is that since that's become apparent in late summer, the competition for lorry drivers has been such that wage rates have risen sharply. And what all of the supermarkets are now telling me is there is quite a sharp influx of a new generation of younger lorry drivers who want to now train to do this because they can see that it's going to pay well. And that's the market working, that's the market reacting.
That's the market work. So he will always get back to the point of free market capitalism. Yes, the market will sort it out. But what's happened is drivers who used to drive bin lorries, bus drivers as well, are jumping from those industries to drive heavy goods vehicles because they're getting paid a lot more and they're leaving vacancies behind. This is creating other types of problems. But none of this was necessary.
But there has been this gap where we've had a shortage of lorry drivers while those new trainees come through. And again, it's one of those features I would suggest of the pandemic, that there were lots of quite unpredictable things.
Once again, the pandemic. He continues to blame the pandemic instead of blaming Brexit. He's an ideologue. He cannot blame Brexit. He has to find an alternative.
For many people, it was a chance to take stock of their life, the job they were doing, what they wanted to do, and it led to some quite fundamental changes in a sharp, condensed fashion that you wouldn't normally see.
Can I just give you one example as well? So if we take HGV drivers, over the summer, a lot of people in industry were saying, we haven't got enough drivers, it's making life really difficult, can you look at the immigration rules? But at the same time, going back to the data, I get a daily data feed, and this was on my holidays in Scotland. I was getting daily data from all of the supermarkets across the range of products that said, actually, while there are not enough drivers, supply of fulfillment was holding up and availability of food was holding up as well. So the data there did not say there was a case to have an HGV driver scheme over.
Because they were suffering shortages of other workers. So he saw, okay, industry is suffering, okay, it's holding up. We're able to get there are shortages in other industries. But as I raised at the beginning of this video, supermarkets were sourcing goods from other places. So yes, certain farmers were not able to produce their produce. They were not selling it to supermarkets. So what did supermarkets do instead? Well, they brought in goods from abroad. Now, they were paying drivers to bring those goods in, so the supermarkets were not having problems. But there were shortages in British industries. There is an attempt, it seems, to say, okay, well, the core problem is the heavy goods vehicle drivers. Yes, they are part of the problem, but there is a shortage all over industry. So as I said, supermarkets adapted. They said, okay, if we can't get fresh meat from farmers in Britain, we'll get our meat from abroad. So when the government asked them, are you suffering shortages? They say, yes, but we're able to manage because we're sourcing them from other places. And the response from the government was, okay, so there's no problem.
Over the summer. And that turned us to looking at Christmas, where the potentially was a problem just because of the big uptick in demand. We worked with the industry after summer to make that case about the uptick in demand, what might happen if it wasn't met through the visa scheme, and then we've got the visa scheme. Now, a number of other things have happened as well, as the Secretary of State says, that actually the objective is to protect food supply. We are reasonably confident, there's no guarantees, but reasonably confident about food supply for Christmas now.
So we're reasonably confident about food supply for Christmas. Yes, because supermarkets are sourcing them from non-British sources. That's the solution. I've said this before, George Eustice will offload responsibility for all of this onto industry. Industry say we can't take all that responsibility because we want to bring drivers, bring workers in from abroad. But we can't because the Home Office won't allow it. And the response from George Eustice and the government is tough, we don't care. We have promised the racists that we will get Brexit done, we will limit the number of foreigners coming into the country. And by doing that, you're going to have to make whatever situation you're in work. It's your responsibility now. We don't care. Going forward, I don't know what's going to happen here, because the industry need workers. They can't get workers. And I think I think the only possible solution to all of this is that British industries will collapse because they're not able to operate. They can't get the workers. The government won't ease the restrictions on immigration because they don't want to piss off the Brexiteers. And the alternative to all of this is that supermarkets and outlets will import goods from abroad. So if you can't get your turkeys from UK suppliers, you get them from Polish suppliers or from German suppliers. And the public won't really know any different. The public will say, oh, look, well, I can get my turkey. I don't really care where it comes from. Brexit has not been such a disaster, and the Brexiteers in government will say, see, everything is working. You know, where we're told about shortages, we resolved the shortages. Sweeping the problem under the carpet, of course. And as we've seen when it comes to trade deals, farmers will be thrown under the bus, or under the tractor, as the case may be. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think about all of this. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee, so why not check it out?